Well, before we had an idea that there was a number of people out there that needed help with sort of emergency level accommodation, but we really couldn't put any numbers on it. We didn't know. In 2018, we only provided 29 bed spaces for the year, and we knew that that wasn't even touching the surface of what actually was going on. So by doing this pilot year, that really allowed us the opportunity to, and again, we've only just touched the surface. There's so many people that still haven't linked in with us, but we provided, 534 bed spaces in our pilot year, which is a vast difference from the year before. So it shows that actually there is a definite need.
I think as well, what this data puts to bed is any argument about the existence and the extent of homelessness on the island. I mean, we've been involved for well over a decade working in this area and pioneering work. And this has been the first time that we've been able to put consistent data in terms of rough sleeping. And so the levels of need suggest we're not talking thousands and thousands of people, but we're talking a significant minority of extremely vulnerable adults on the Isle of Man who are in desperate need of better services.
59 different people used it, so 534. So obviously a number of them were repeat people. The majority Manx residents, but not all. For some people listening, there will be the attitude that perhaps this isn't the amount of people that we should be worried about. How significant can you relay these numbers to people? Why is it a significant number when it is, percentage-wise, actually a very small proportion of how many people are here?
In the UK, where there's been decades and decades of research and resources given to homelessness in the UK, there's a ratio that they suggest that it's 1 to 12. So for every rough sleeper, there are 12 other people in emergency accommodation, in unsuitable and temporary accommodation who are suffering from forms of homelessness. So that already gives you a sense that although we've seen 59 different individuals needing that emergency shelter at our drop-in, there are potentially well over 600 different individuals needing wider homelessness services. Graih as a whole through 2019 saw 300 different individuals. That was with our daytime work as well as our things at the shelter. And obviously we work closely with the likes of Housing Matters working in this area, who also see numbers running into the hundreds. The rationale behind services towards the most vulnerable people is that these people, when they're in crisis, economically cost a huge amount of money. It's expensive when people are sicker, when they go into hospital, they stay in hospital longer, very expensive to keep people in hospital. If they're in the criminal justice system, and we know people who are in the criminal justice system simply because they don't have safe and stable accommodation, also very expensive. So there's a really strong financial argument towards providing better services to people who are homeless, as well as a moral argument that says these are some of the most vulnerable people in our society who are really struggling with life on the Isle of Man, and it just shouldn't be the case. You know, they deserve much better than this.
What makes you think, from these findings particularly, that there are many more people that perhaps haven't come forward yet?
Oh, well, working closely with Housing Matters, we know that there are numbers of people who haven't used the night shelter at Graih, who are sofa surfing and on their books waiting for accommodation to be found. So we do know that there's figures there. I don't know what they are. But we also know we have people who phone us up and ask for support financially and in other ways, helping them link in with other services, statutory services that are out there that aren't using our night shelter, that are sofa surfing, but they've not actually necessarily come through our doors, but we still touch base with them and we link in with them. So we do know that the numbers are much higher than what we're seeing. But just going back to your question before, the ethical side of it and the moral side of it is, you know, even one person who has to sleep rough or who has to sofa surf, people think sofa surfing isn't homelessness, but actually, how do you do your washing? You can't just use somebody's washing machine and just then dry their, your laundry and things. Where do you dry your underwear? Those are simple things that you take for granted when you've got your own space. When you don't have your own space, you're reliant on the generosity of the person you're staying with. Quite often, that's maybe another chaotic person who's actually got their own accommodation. And those relationships can fail in the middle of the night. It's really quite fickle. It can move, and it isn't secure. So having one person in our community isn't good enough, let alone having provided the numbers that we have. That shows there is a definite need, and we really do have a moral obligation to do something about that.
What do you think stops more people coming forward? Is there a general shame? Is it a matter of pride that people don't want to admit the situation they might be in?
Well, there could be a variety of reasons. I think sometimes there might be a little bit of that. Some people might be, I don't want to go to the homeless shelter, I don't want to go to the drop-in centre where there'll be other people that are maybe struggling as well. Or it might just be that they've not had that need because they've maybe got family or friends who are just putting them up, and they manage to bounce around with them for a number of for a season, for a number of months or whatever, and then they come to us when that actually the generosity finishes, and they're saying actually you need to step on with your life, and then they might come to us or Housing Matters for help,
I think as well, these numbers and what we've seen through our guests, numbers are just numbers, but what we've seen through our guests is huge levels of mental ill health.
Yeah.
And I think it's very difficult for people to understand how vulnerable and isolated people can become extremely quickly, and that in itself can be a barrier towards accessing services in the community that might well be there. People become very isolated, very afraid, very anxious, and extremely vulnerable. And for the vast majority of our guests, they're suffering from chronic mental ill health, and so that leaves them extremely vulnerable. So it's not the case sometimes that you're in a place to make very rational decisions. You're very alone, you're struggling with mental ill health, sometimes physical ill health as well, and that can lead to all sorts of difficulties even if there are services available.
And that's where we link in closely with the statutory services. So we link in very closely with community mental health, with the adult generic team in social services, the health visitor for vulnerable adults. We link in really closely with those services, and we all communicate with each other, which I really think is quite key. We work with some of the most vulnerable and some of the most poorly people with their mental health. And sometimes they don't come in and use our service, but because we've built that relationship with them through maybe community support or they've been to the drop-in for some food but they've not stayed in the night shelter, then we can try and help them link in or try and keep an eye on them so that when they actually do reach that level where we think that they really need some serious help, we can link in the other services that might not actually have that connection in with them.
It fairly ties in, I suppose, with how it's all funded, and obviously you're working in conjunction with lots of different people, and that's how you did the year-long funding through the lottery, through Treasury, through health and social care. I'm guessing from the way you're talking to me now that you'd like to continue this, and if you do that, you will need more funding. Can you give me an idea of the situation as it stands?
Yes, so we were given a pot of money for the 12-month pilot scheme, which finished at the end of January. And as you said, that we worked with a coalition of partners who funded that, and we've been hosted very generously at the Shelter by Broadway Baptist Church as well. The situation as it stands is that we think that the numbers suggest that the need is there. This service, there are people staying at the shelter most nights. This service is desperately needed, and we certainly didn't want to close at the end of January in the middle of winter, and we were able to get some funding to enable us to extend that until the summer. So the Elizabeth Clucas Trust and an anonymous donor have very kindly given us some funding that has enabled us to stretch the service to the summer. One of the difficulties of being a small charity is that you work on a hand-to-mouth basis. We don't have reserves. We spend what money we get providing services to our guests. What we really like is sustainable funding to provide security not only for our guests but in terms of staff retention and training. At the moment we don't have that. Erica's involved in conversations with government particularly about whether there's possibilities of some form of ongoing funding. But at the moment, as things stand, the shelter will be closing in the summer, and we're very keen to hear from anyone who can help with funding.
And that's early summer as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So what is it, June?
Yeah.
June. Okay.
Yeah.
So you mentioned a government on an ongoing basis. Is that the ideal then? You would have some kind of agreement with government which provide funding annually?
I'd really like to see that. I mean, on the Isle of Man, there's no legislation for homelessness, so the government have no statutory obligation to do anything, whereas across they do. I'd like to see government support our most vulnerable, some of our most vulnerable in society. So I'd love to see a commitment from them for the work that we're doing, helping some of those most vulnerable with the emergency level support. Now, we're not asking them necessarily to fund the whole thing. We don't want this to become a government thing, but we'd love them to financially commit to actually providing some of the finances so that we can have that stability, and that there are other services that are needed that we'd love to get involved in as well. But we have to stabilise what we've got first, and that's not even stable at the moment, is it?
I think what we have clear data from this pilot that suggests that there's a very vulnerable minority of people who need better services. you've got groups like Graih and Housing Matters who've pioneered effective work in this for over a decade and who are willing to engage in the way that we do successfully with very vulnerable people. And I think it'll be interesting to see how we as a society, it makes a powerful statement about who we value and why we value them, what resources we give to which areas. We would love to see a strong statement made to say we value people even when they're in the most darkest and difficult times of their lives. We value people enough to provide properly funded, sustainable services to them. We're willing to be part of that. Graih is ready to continue to do that work. We simply need a bit of support to enable us to continue.
And we are grateful for the funding that we got for that year, you know, from Treasury, from DHSC, from Manx Lottery, from the Church as Alive and Man, from businesses and things. The people that came together and provided the funding for that year's pilot project, you know, we're ever so grateful for. And it's allowed us to be able to get the statistics, the data together to say, actually, this service is needed. We're not just pie in the sky thinking and sort of thinking, oh, that would be nice to do that. We've got statistics here to show that actually this service is needed, and some of the most chaotic and vulnerable adults are using this service, and it would only be fair to be able to continue doing that and help them get the support and link them back into the networks that they need to be part of.
It's important perhaps to add as well that we've worked obviously with the pilot with a whole host of other agencies, the police, benefits, social services. It's not just Graih who are saying that we think that the shelter and the work is an important service. We've got strong support from all those grassroots agencies who are often seeing vulnerable people at very difficult times as well, who really value the work of the shelter and would love to see that service continue. So there's a broad coalition both within and without government to say this actually is really valuable. We think this sort of service should continue.